We'll move on to our next segment, and we'll welcome David Thompson from the National Council of Nonprofits, and also we'll welcome Kim Moreland back to the stage for a follow-up conversation. And this one is going to get to a topic that I know is a favorite for many of the folks in our community: indirect cost rates. And in particular, I want to just flag a couple new policies in the uniform guidance on the topic of indirect cost rates. The first is in section 200.414 that talks about indirect cost rates writ large. A couple of changes there. One is really intended to provide consistency for how federally negotiated indirect cost rates are provided. And those require all federal awarding agencies to use the federally negotiated indirect cost rate for their recipients unless there's an exception made by the head of the department or someone to whom they've delegated their authority. And even then, there are some conditions applied in terms of being transparent about those exceptions, including it in a notice of funding announcement, notifying OMB, and communicating that to all stakeholders up front. Another new policy in that section, which is really intended to reduce the administrative burden of the whole negotiation process, is an option that allows a non-federal entity that has a negotiated rate to extend that negotiated rate for up to 4 years with the approval of the cognizant agency for indirect costs. So right there you have another potential additional flexibility. And the third additional policy, and this is one that I think will be important to our folks today, is that we provide a de minimis indirect cost rate, which is 10% of modified total direct costs. And that's really intended for entities who have never had an indirect cost rate and for whom negotiating one is really an administrative burden that could even be a barrier to entry that might prevent them from even really applying for a federal award, because they wouldn't be able to have an indirect cost rate, and they might not be able to afford it if all their costs were therefore then not covered. Very important linkage to this set of policies is one when we talk about our subawards, and this is where I think our folks today will focus in. There's a requirement in section 200.313, requirements for pass-through entities, that actually requires pass-through entities to pass down an indirect cost rate to their subrecipients. If the subrecipient has a federally negotiated indirect cost rate, that rate is required to be applied. If not, the pass-through entity may negotiate a rate, or they may provide the 10% rate. So let me turn it over to my folks here today and see what questions you all may have about these new policies.
We have lots. Thank you very much, Victoria. That's the best summary of the third part I've heard out loud, so I very much appreciate it. I am David Thompson with the National Council of Nonprofits. I have the honor of working with a network of state associations of nonprofits that have focused on fixing government nonprofit contracting and grant-making processes across the country. Dave Mader opened the segment today talking about the goal is simplification. We're delighted to be on the side of simplification because typically we are fighting complexification, which is what we find across the country. So we're all on the right side now. Our process is to identify problems in the contracting and the grant-making system across the country, to work with our partners in government to identify solutions, and then work like crazy to implement those solutions. Victoria described the solution, the very important solution in the uniform guidance on payment of indirect costs. Let me put it in perspective because most folks don't understand this. Typical overhead costs for both for-profit and nonprofit organizations is in the range of 25 to 35%. If you ask most nonprofits, you'll discover that when they're contracting or providing services on behalf of governments, they typically are have their indirect costs reimbursement capped. And the vast majority of those, 75%, are capped at 10% or less, or paid 10% or less. And remember I said 25 to 35 is normal. So this solution is enormous. I'd like to ask Matt Hamu to talk about the experience in Illinois in terms of taking the OMB guidance and applying it to the work you do. But let me start with a quote that was in the frequently asked questions that have been referenced regularly. They came out the Friday before Labor Day. All of you on the COFAR website, just scroll down 2 notches and you'll find these frequently asked questions that were done very, very well. In describing the indirect cost provision and the requirement for pass-throughs to pay that, they explained why. The cost principles are designed to provide that federal awards pay their fair share of the costs. Matt, is that a novel concept?
That might be a trick question. So, and if I may, and thank you for the question. And first, let me say, as the Assistant Secretary of Operations for DHS, which has over 4,000 contracts, over 2,000 vendors, we grant out well in excess of $4 billion. We were faced with to go back to what you originally said, simplification versus making things more complex. Back in 2010, Governor Quinn heard the calls of the state associations of nonprofits who said, please, make this possible for us to do business with you. You have 5 different ways of doing everything across every state agency. The governor at the time then created a bill which took 5 of the human service agencies and put them under a mandate to do exactly what you said. Make things add value, make them more simple. And as it relates to rates, it is not a secret that, especially in the world of human services, rates have sat stale for years. As times have changed, with the advent of the internet even, rates have stayed the same. And when we started implementing what is now referred to as the Management Improvement Initiative, which is also rolled into 2 other pieces of legislation in Illinois, by the way, adopting the federal rules for most grants, we found that what you said about everything being more complex was exactly true. There were 5 or more ways of submitting indirect cost proposals to each state agency. There were multiple standards on how to review and vet those requests. And we said, okay, enough is enough, we have to fix this. And what that meant from a state agency perspective was a change of culture, aggressive change management, looking at, a survey of asking each individual program within many, although fewer silos than in the past, still siloed areas of grant making and said, how are you looking at your rates? How are you asking your subrecipients for their indirect costs? And what we did was create one form for budget reporting with a separate table for cost allocation submissions, and by doing that, we made the process simple. To use your word, we have one way of submitting something to the state. And then we said that's not enough. That's only step 1. Now how are we going to review it with some level of consistency and efficiency, with an eye on the things that are important to our subrecipients? Well, under the Grant Accountability Transparency Act, we centralized authority under the Governor's Office of Management and Budget to do just that. We published an RFP, or publishing an RFP now, for a master contract for cost allocation review. And for lack of a better word, building a docket based on how stale or fresh rates are, whether a rate ever existed, getting to the guidance that's offered, so that there could be a systematic approach without injecting more variability on the review, approval, and vetting of those indirect cost rates.
Very, very impressive. I think the key point you said quickly was that you actually incorporated the contents, the substance of the uniform guidance into Illinois law. Don't know if other states are open for that, but it's a fascinating concept. I really want to get to the lessons learned, because nonprofits that are listening or watching can learn a great deal from what you've been doing in Illinois. I know you've worked closely with our member Donors Forum, which is the state association in Illinois. And I know that other states and local governments can learn from that expel. So I want to get to those as quickly as we can. But first, can we clarify a couple of topics? You were talking about, you said stale rates. We call those out-of-date rates. How do we get to the point? Frequently, nonprofits experience a per diem, such as the price per day for a child at an overnight facility. Frequently, those rates were set 20 years ago. Frequently, those rates were set, maybe they included indirect costs, most likely they did not. How do you get, is that what you're talking about with your docket, when you get from an out-of-date rate to incorporate the indirect cost provisions and use the uniform guidance.
That's absolutely true. What has existed in the past are these rates that have existed in certain parts of government that folks were uncertain how to actually impact or affect or submit a new proposal for those indirect costs. And because of the variability both in the review and vetting, we centralized that review to make sure that the possibility was there for that rate to be adjusted. It's almost impossible to get a rate looked at unless there's a way of actually addressing it. And I said docket as more it's a prioritized list of review based on the stakeholder engagement. And you mentioned lessons learned, and this kind of dovetails into that. One of the most important lessons learned was if we wanted to know where the most stale rates are, we engaged our stakeholders, our communities, our nonprofit associations, our provider associations, and our provider groups, and said, everyone come to the table. In fact, our table at the Management Improvement Initiative had over 15 to 20 provider representatives who came to opine as to, rates that may be well overdue in terms of review. Then we formalized a process on the submission of those indirect cost plans with a way of addressing them and vetting them for approval. It is not an easy process, and another lesson learned that dovetails well into your question is we couldn't do this alone. We had to incorporate the expertise of an independent, objective person. Government agencies are always doing what they do. They have a lot of things going on. We're under-resourced. And is there anyone who is going to be the champion of change and corral 5 or more state agencies to start looking at their business practices? It was difficult until we've got an independent facilitator, someone who served as a catalyst not only for the discussions that needed to be had, for the collection of concerns from the provider or nonprofit community, and then bringing them to the table to actually advance it, bringing the right stakeholders from the right agencies to make sure that we found progress on each and every concern that was already out with our recipients, with our subrecipients. None of the issues that you mentioned or that plague nonprofits or a provider community are a secret, right? These are things that if we listen carefully, they resonate right through.
Before we get too far into the collaboration or the kumbaya part of the discussion, let me ask, I don't know if this is a hardball or a softball, but the uniform guidance talks about grants reform. A lot of talk about federal assistance. Those terms are foreign to most of us, and the nonprofits I'm mainly talking about are frontline, smaller organizations that are providing services in communities on behalf of governments. Can states and local governments avoid complying with the uniform guidance and the requirement of paying indirect costs by calling the written agreement between the nonprofit and the government a contract instead of a grant? Because we know some of our relationships are contracts, some are grants, and in New York they actually have a grants contract, so it's very confusing. Can you form Trump substance here, do you think?
Well, I don't know if that's a hardball or softball, and I'll tell you this. So the guidance that's issued through law, codified through rule, is exactly that. It is a binding authority that tells us what to do with an intent, with a specific intent. And can you meander your way in and out of intent? Well, when we heard from folks saying, oh, this money loses its traits, loses its federalism, it loses the principles that apply to it and the rules just because I put it in this bucket. For better or worse, we generally, I said, no. I mean, you can't just call federal money, federal grant money something else and then think all the rules fall off. That cuts both ways. Some folks say, well, and I know you're referencing the de minimis 10%. That's the hardball part of this. But there are assertions that say, well, those rules don't apply to me because I just called this a contract, so I don't have to report anymore, right? Well, no. We tell our, sorry, subrecipients, you just because the name is different doesn't mean that the intent of those rules, those binding rules, just fell off somehow.
I'd like to actually jump in here because I think, Matt, you said it perfectly that just because the name is different doesn't mean those rules fall off. And in the uniform guidance, there is a section that says almost exactly that. which I think is probably worth flagging here, that provides guidance to pass-through entities on subaward versus contract determinations, and really makes that distinction that if that award is to carry out the mission of the federal award, then it's a subaward, and those terms and conditions flow down with it. If it's to acquire goods or services, and it is sometimes a gray area, there is a degree of judgment there, certainly, but then if it is to acquire goods and services really for the benefit of that pass-through entity, then it becomes a procurement. So
The relationships you have with, I think you said 2,000 or 3,000 nonprofits across Illinois, are those mostly, do you see those as in the grant category now, as
Well,
Victoria just
they're
described?
clearly grant contracts. No, I'm just kidding. So those are in the grant arena. A majority of our contracts, we call them community service agreements. They're not contracts, not even. They are legally a contractual document, but they're community service agreements based on a grant relationship.
Terrific. Given the work you've done with the management improvement innovation or initiative and the preparation of the implementation of the uniform guidance, what are the lessons learned?
Well, and I mentioned some of these, but I want to go back.
And actually, let me interrupt. What lessons can both nonprofits and states and local governments learn from your experience? Because we're in this together. We want to make sure this is a collaborative effort.
And I'm glad you said collaborative, because I believe that is the strongest lesson learned. That this is a significant collaboration. It requires interplay between every stakeholder, from state agency to nonprofit community to other partners, and I said partners for a reason, because of the grant relationship. We ultimately are all partners and rely on everybody. Our responsibilities flow through, and getting the right stakeholders to the table with the facilitator to make sure we kept all the I's dotted and the T's crossed, and making sure we considered impact in each different service area. The cookie cutter does not apply to the world of human services, for sure. And what we found was getting the folks with the expertise to the table, with an independent, objective person to keep everybody calm when we started talking about changing things, was really the strongest lesson learned. The other parts of this were getting the technology infrastructure, being able to share documents and data across 5 or 6 human service agencies really simplified the submission methodology and the review methodology, and took administrative burden away from this process. If we tried doing this without centralizing the submissions and the data we were all looking at, our provider community, our nonprofit organizations would have ran away saying, you're just killing us. We can't do this again in a different way. And I believe those were the strong lessons learned.
Mm-hmm.
I might just chime in, since I have the opportunity. So I certainly admire what you're doing in Illinois, and just one state north, in Wisconsin, we are just beginning to have some of these conversations, and I think that's the status in many university communities. And so we have a long, healthy, and continuing relationship with our friends in state government, and we need that to continue beyond any regulatory provision. And so how do you suggest we go about ensuring compliance with the provisions regarding F&A rates and recovery of indirect costs in a way that is collaborative rather than adversarial?
And it goes back to the engagement with the stakeholders. When we are defining a new process that is value add without redundancy to ensure compliance, we want to make sure, especially at DHS in Illinois being the safety net agency, we have small, mid-sized providers, nonprofits who need to be at the table or represented at the table, so we ensure that when we are seeking compliance, we're not adversely impacting the ultimate goal of even this guidance, which is that outcome, which is what this grant money was meant for. So we will not take a step that hurts. Government people, not everyone will agree, but we try not to take steps that will hurt outcomes or the administration of these grants. And the best way to ensure that is to bring folks who are in each respective service area to the table and ask them what this impact will have and what is the best way of achieving compliance. If I need to collect data or documents or outcomes from you, which Illinois also has an ambitious effort in doing. We want to make sure we don't do anything to force them to take a couple steps back in their productivity and their delivery of service.
Thank you.
You used the phrase culture shift. This is requiring a culture shift that you in Illinois have been pursuing a culture shift for a number of years. We recognize that nonprofits in working collaboratively with government is going to require some trust. So our state associations are working closely to promote relationships and trust. The uniform guidance challenges something that should not be conventional wisdom, but frequently is, and that is just the concept of imposing caps on indirect costs. Some people are of the view that that's some way of ensuring efficiency. If you cap indirect costs, more money goes to programs, theoretically. The nonprofit perspective is this is a guaranteed way to deny or frustrate efficiencies and greater impact. Do you have views? Is there a formal view or a personal view that you could share?
And I mean, this is a personal view, and it's currently the path we're taking in Illinois. You know, initially when we started working on this 5 years ago, and I wasn't as familiar with the world of human services or grants, I said, you know, capping this would be a good idea. And
Capping indirect costs?
Capping indirect costs, and that was a bad idea 5 years later, I think. And through stakeholder engagement, I was taught why that was such a bad idea. Because it ignores the ultimate goal of that grant, which is the outcome. If you truly want to find innovative ways and efficient ways of getting to an outcome, you can't arbitrarily cap something. It will prevent exactly that, creative and innovation. Furthermore, as long as costs, and every grant is different, every scope is different, indirect or costs, overhead, can be different for good reason, and as long as they are allowable and they can be provided, vetted, and reviewed. An arbitrary cap seeks to really hurt the ultimate goal of getting to that outcome, whatever it may be, because it puts this false parameter and false restriction on the ability to administer it.
There's some challenges in enforcing the indirect cost rate provision or many of the proposals here. The earlier panel talked about compliance, talked about the audits and internal controls and things like that. And the ultimate question is for what purpose or who will be held accountable? Will anyone be held accountable? We know that if a local government ignores the provisions, at some point there will be a determination from an inspector general or someone saying you've ignored, these were provisions that should have been applied. I don't know, would imagine there would be back pay or some other payment requirements and things like that. That's not in anybody's interest. What can nonprofits do now to get it right so that it makes it easier for states to implement? What can states do so that we're not in litigation after the fact, that we're getting everyone together to implement systems that work, implement trainings that work so that program officers and nonprofit leaders are all learning the same rules at the same time? What can we do together?
Well, I mean, together we can learn from the success and the lessons learned from other states who have reached the outcomes, the ideal outcomes, and mirror. And in this, I heard the word evolve earlier. I believe the world of grant administration is evolving. It's becoming stronger. It's becoming more fit for the ultimate goal rather than just parameters that fit around it to try to control it. And that being said, states have to engage their stakeholders, and some states are engaged by their stakeholders with no way to ignore the calls of their members, and that say you have to do this correctly. Now, you know, how are states going to follow the law and the rules that are codified? Can they ignore them? I would say talk to their lawyers. You cannot ignore things that are in law or codified. You have to use either the valid exception process that exists in the guidelines or implement them as they are written, or fear from your auditors.
And I think on that note, I'll just go ahead and jump in and say thank you. I think, Matt, of course, you make an excellent point, and David, these things are in the guidance, and we do have tools like audits to understand how folks are implementing the guidance and to monitor that implementation. But I think your underlying theme, which is the one I really want to highlight, is that it's actually much more productive if we engage and we have this conversation far before it gets to that point. And I think we heard that from our auditors earlier today when we were talking about internal controls as well. You can even engage them early if there are questions. And I think that you guys have actually provided a shining example of that collaboration. And we hope that that can be a lesson learned for everyone watching here today. This is just the beginning of the conversation. And I think on that note, I'd like to just say thank you to our panelists and turn it over to our controller, David Mader, for some closing remarks.
Thanks, Victoria. And on behalf of all of us at OMB, thank you for, first of all, for the panelists for taking the time for what I found it incredibly fascinating and educational for me as sort of the newbie into this space. And I certainly think that the audience, the large audience that participated in today, really got a lot out of the conversation. And I think it reinforced what Beth and I both said in our opening remarks, and I think a lot of the panelists talked about, that we're all in this together. We all share the same objective and the outcome. We may work for different organizations, but by working together and collaboratively, we can actually achieve what we all want to achieve. So thank you and good luck.